It was a Monday, the 16th of August, 1819. Anne Fards leaves her house at 1:30, her baby son William in her arms. She's going towards St. Peter's Church, some household errand pulling her away, and as she approaches the church, she hears before she sees a mass of people, singing and chanting. 100,000 or more, all gathered in St. Peter's Field. Magistrates, the military, and special constables looked out over the protesters. Anne, suddenly in no particular rush, turns back, happy to lock her door and ride out whatever trouble was coming. Most of her neighbours seem to agree. As a unit of yeomanry ride past, and Anne crosses the road, she hears a distant gallop. But before she can react, she is pushed to the floor by a horse, her baby flying from her arms onto the hard pavement 2 meters in front of her. William Fards is the first victim of the Manchester and Salford yeomanry, but he won't be the last. In just half an hour, the field of 100,000 would be empty but for the wounded and dead. Nearly 700 men, women and children were seriously injured, and 18 people died, slaughtered by a drunk, incompetent and corrupt police force, bought and owned by the masters of capital. This was the Peterloo Massacre. Before we can talk about what happened in St. Peter's Field, or St. Peter's Square as it is now known, we have to understand why people were there in the first place. The rally was organised locally, Manchester, in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, a small town suddenly coming to grips with its place as one of the largest industrial cities of its time. Despite this, Manchester had no MP, and even if it gained one, voting was restricted to just 2% of the population. The reform movement, a thorn in the ruling class's side since the 1790s, was recently reborn and ready and willing to mobilise the new working class of the north. The main campaign behind this rally was universal male suffrage then, although some radicals did campaign for full suffrage a full 100 years before it would come about in Britain. Of particular note for the Peterloo Massacre, the crowd consisted of a larger percentage of women than was normal, 12%. At a time where women didn't have the vote and few had much legal autonomy, this is pretty impressive. The women, although some of them were integrated into the general audience, generally stood separately, dressed in all white, carrying their own banners. But it was more than suffrage that brought people to St. Peter's Field. What became known as the Condition of England problem was composed firstly of the devastation caused by the French wars, and the second problem was that of capitalism, or less broadly, the emerging proletariat, the resistance against reform, and the growing cities. A reactionary government sat on the ruins of an aristocratic society, seemingly oblivious to the changes surrounding them, and responding to any and all criticism with an iron fist. Indeed, workers in this period had very few rights and were actively outlawed from organising effectively. Despite this, the looming figure of the new proletariat was a terrifying spectre, and only seemed to grow more in size and power by the day. In this atmosphere, the yeomanry were born. After the sight in 1817 of peaceful workers carrying blankets, the bourgeoisie, fearful of unrest in Manchester and Salford, especially as so many workers had lost their jobs, formed the aptly named Manchester and Salford Yeomanry. The yeomanry, basically volunteer cavalry, were recruited mostly from the petty bourgeois, in this case small farmers and pub landlords. They were provided with a subsidy and acted as state-sanctioned muscle against the rising reform movement. This idea of arming the petty bourgeois to crush the proletariat, it proved very popular. The gathering at St. Peter's Square was harried by state powers before it had even begun. Radicals, mainly from the Manchester Observer, organised under the banner of the Manchester Patriotic Union, and, following in the footsteps of previous peaceful protests, organised a great assembly for the 2nd of August, even convincing a leading radical of the time, Henry Hunt, to come and speak. More on him later. That letter, though, was captured by government spies, and in the powder keg of class tension that was Manchester in 1819, the government became convinced a revolution was imminent. Firstly, the gathering was postponed to the 9th of August, with local bourgeoisie clamouring for the gathering to be declared illegal. Despite the official verdict advising the local magistrates and law enforcement to allow the march and not intervene, the 9th of August date too was scrapped. Hunt and the other organisers declared a new meeting for the 16th of August, stating they were there to discuss legal and peaceful means to reform. They would prove to the elite that they were peaceful by refusing to carry weapons and by marching in orderly columns. This didn't seem to deter suspicion. In fact, it intensified it. They're marching like an army, no visible weapons. The paranoia of the state even led to them clearing the field of stones and sticks beforehand in case the armed and armoured soldiers were hurt. Again, we see this pattern reverberate throughout history. St. Peter's Field was chosen as the assembly point, an open piece of land in the midst of a rapidly expanding town. All the attendees would be peaceable in their finest clothes and would start from their towns and villages, coming together as one unit from all across the region. However, what gave the meeting its numbers were the native Mancunians, who came out in their tens of thousands to support suffrage, the end of Corn Laws, and the rights of working class people. And many of them came out for one man, Henry Hunt. Henry Hunt was to be the key speaker at the gathering. Hunt was a fantastic speaker. He had a particular talent for passionate, rousing speeches, which gained him the nickname The Orator. His philosophies, plainly speaking the aims of the radical movement rather than cloaking it in secrecy and seeking reform through mass organised legal movements, gained him widespread popularity across the whole of the left. But Henry Hunt was not just another well-educated reformer. He proved his mettle both before and after Peterloo, remaining until his dying day a democratic radical, facing scorn and derision when he was elected as an MP by constantly working for votes for women, an end to censorship and the rights of the working class. Hunt was a very popular figure, as you might imagine, and during this time he was on the rise, not yet an elected politician. In Hunt, the workers saw a leader, though, and it was as much Hunt's presence as the mass of workers which worried the state so much. A charismatic young leader and a whole lot of angry workers could only lead to one thing. So assured of the seditious nature of the meeting, the ruling class began to plot. So two sides were facing off at St. Peter's Field. On the one side, working class people from across the region and charismatic leaders fighting for suffrage. On the other side, a terrified bourgeoisie, ready to unleash its attack dogs. This massacre had to happen. Let me clarify that. The political atmosphere in Britain had been racking up, and many protests and gatherings had been put down with force before. It was only a matter of time before the open disgust and distrust the bourgeoisie held for the working class would have to express itself through mass slaughter. A heavily organised working class protest, where the participants marched in neat formation. The bourgeoisie easily placed their own fears of revolution onto these protesters, and revolution must be met with sword and fire. So alongside the local petty bourgeois, organised as the Manchester Yeomanry, who else was part of the government forces? Well, firstly, the magistrates and the special constables. So magistrates were basically lay judges, And in this period of English history specifically, we're beginning to make the transition from justices of the peace, who represented the law to common people, into the formal ranks of the new bureaucracy, acting in coordination with the emerging police. The police themselves, the special constables, were volunteers and had not yet been formally organised into the apparatus of state terror, but obviously that was still their role. As well as all these agents of law, the military was present. On direct orders of Parliament, the 15th Hussars watched over the protesters, ready and willing to crush rebellion. Like the yeomanry, the Hussars were also cavalry, but they had much more discipline. The yeomanry in general were noted to be lacking in any kind of respect for due process. They had spent the morning getting drunk and talking amongst themselves, riling themselves up into a frenzy, ready to strike down these rebellious scum. As mentioned earlier, the first victim of the Peterloo Massacre was a baby, William Fyldes. But how did the yeomanry come to be thundering up a residential road? Let's take a look at a map and see where everyone is. So alongside the Manchester Yeomanry, you also have the Cheshire Yeomanry and the 15th Hussars on the northwest. On Brasenose Street you have the 31st Regiment. These are infantrymen. To the south, the Royal Horse Artillery, who have 2 large cannons. There's also a division of the Manchester Yeomanry in the east. In all, on the government side, we have about 1,500 men. The day begins with the assembly as workers from around the area begin to arrive in St. Peter's Field. At 8 a.m. the meeting officially starts when Samuel Bamford gives a speech. From 8 to 12, as more and more people arrive, the government forces march and take up their positions. Soon they'll decide that the town is in danger. For now, they line up special constables to clear a path if they decide to disperse the meeting. By noon, both George Swift and Robert Wilde address the crowd, Swift being a young shoemaker well known in the local area. The hustings, the improvised stage speakers are using, grows bigger as the crowd piles carts and chairs together to allow both more speakers, including reporters, and for Elizabeth Gaunt, who, true to her name, was taken ill and is lifted onto the hustings. As Joseph Moorhouse, another popular figure, arrives, the magistrates panic, realising their special constables are now embedded within the crowd, and they give the order to arrest Hunt and the other speakers. Messages are sent, and the government forces prepare to take action. They give the order. As Henry Hunt climbs on to the hustings, William Fyldes, a few streets away, flies from his mother's arms. The yeomanry, on the orders of the magistrates, led by Captain Burley, charge into the crowd. Raising their swords high and cheering, people gathered didn't even realise what had happened until the screams began. Some of the men due to be arrested have already fled, but that doesn't stop the slaughter. They cut through the crowd to reach the hustings, slashing with sabres and trampling people packed in like sardines. In just a few minutes, the yeomanry have killed 18 and injured 700, including women and children, explicitly targeting the female-only sections, and as Bamford, the first speaker, attested, on the breaking of the crowd, the yeomanry wheeled, and, dashing wherever there was an opening, they followed, pressing and wounding. Women and tender youths were indiscriminately sabred or trampled. A young married woman of our party, with her face all bloody, her hair streaming about her, her bonnet hanging by a string, and her apron weighted with stones, kept her assailant at bay until she fell backwards and was near being taken, but she got away covered with severe bruises. In 10 minutes from the commencement of the havoc, the field was an open and almost deserted space. The hustings remained, with a few broken and hewed flagstaffs erect, and a torn and gashed banner or two dropping, whilst over the whole field were strewed caps, bonnets, hats, shawls and shoes, and other parts of male and female dress, trampled, torn and bloody. Several mounds of human flesh still remained where they had fallen, crushed down and smothered. Some of these still groaning, others with staring eyes were gasping for breath, and others would never breathe again. It was a massacre. Protesters not even able to fight back, crushed by both the horsemen and each other. Even as people fled en masse from the charge, the 15th Hussars are sent in to rescue the yeomanry, and as the leaders are arrested and the military and police withdraw, the field is left quiet, except from the cries of the wounded, and littered with blood and gore from the dead and the dying that were not able to flee. No words can adequately explain what has just happened, and as the entire nation reeled, and Manchester mourned and cared for their ill, people from all walks of life began to examine and explain what had happened on that August afternoon. The massacre was a watershed moment. There was no denying the truth of that day, witnessed by so many and by so many prominent journalists. For a while it was a unifying moment. Both the moderate left and the die-hard radicals came together to condemn, with the strongest language possible, the slaughter. It became known as Peterloo, in parody of the Battle of Waterloo that had defeated Napoleon 4 years earlier. But the government saw in the public's horrified response to the slaughter simply more sedition and rebellion. The men arrested were rushed through the courts, along with anyone caught defending the victims or showing sympathy to reform. The 6 Acts, essentially just state censorship, cracked down on anything the government thought was seditious. Peterloo, however, could not be ignored. The crackdowns actually led to a renaissance of political satire in England, as writers skirted the 6 Acts by cloaking their criticism in comedy. It's a really hard sentence to say. Although Peterloo didn't provoke mass uprisings, only a few fooled conspiracies and riots, it did play a part in forcing the government's hand when it came to reform. Suppression only works for a limited amount of time before it becomes too oppressive, and the British state had no choice but to slowly reform the government, culminating in the Great Reform Act of 1832, which abolished rotten boroughs and granted the franchise to most men, although not all. This reform, however, would end up protecting the interests of the new bourgeoisie, firstly by excluding the working class from franchise, but opening the door to the petty bourgeois. They secured the moderate left and severed the alliance between reformers and radicals. Secondly, because this reform bill, and the others that followed it, secured Britain's political system for the decades that followed. As waves of revolution spread all over Europe in the springtime of the People's 1848, the English radicals continued to work within the parliamentary system, spurred on by the success of the previous bill, and thus didn't engage in the mass insurrections common to that time. Although not avenged, the spirit of Peterloo remains, and it still haunts the halls of Westminster. It's a reminder to ourselves and to those who rule us that when the mask slips, no one likes the face underneath. I'd like to end, if I may, on an extract from one of the great poems to come out of Peterloo, one which I think really captures the sense of shock that this event really had on people, that to see, especially these moderate liberals who sort of saw the police and the army as a progressive force, to see them unleashed on the workers. And it's a poem called The Mask of Anarchy by Percy Shelley. Last came Anarchy. He rode on a white horse, splashed with blood. He was pale even to the lips, like death in the apocalypse. And he wore a kingly crown, and in his grasp a spectre shone. On his brow this mark I saw, I am God and King and Law. With a pace stately and fast, over English land he passed, trampling to a mire of blood the adoring multitude. And a mighty troop around with their trampling shook the ground, waving each a bloody sword, for the service of their Lord, and with glorious triumph they rode through England proud and gay, drunk as with intoxication on the wine of desolation. O'er fields and towns from sea to sea passed the pageant swift and free, tearing up and trampling down till they came to London town, and each dweller, panic-stricken, felt his heart with terror sicken, hearing the tempestuous cry of the triumph of anarchy. For with pomp to meet him came, clothed in arms like blood and flame, the hired murderers who did sing, "Thou art God and Law and King. We have waited weak and lone for thy coming, mighty one. Our purses are empty, our swords are cold. Give us glory and blood and gold." Lawyers and priests, a motley crowd, to the earth their pale brows bowed, like a bad prayer not over loud, whispering, "Thou art law and God." Then all cried with one accord, "Thou art King and God and Lord. Anarchy, to thee we bow. Be thy name made holy now." Thanks for listening, comrades. I don't know if you noticed, but the microphone's a little better. You probably haven't noticed because I'm really bad at editing and also writing. Anyway, Patreon. Also, I've got a Discord. It's in the description. Give me money. I want to buy some ice cream, but I don't have any money. Pay me. Next video is the August Revolution.